It was the test. The first true ground-level proof that the tide of war in the Pacific could, in fact, be reversed. Everything that would follow, the grueling, bloody campaigns in New Guinea, the island hopping across the vast expanse of the Central Pacific, the recapture of the Philippines, and the eventual push toward the Japanese home islands, hinged on the outcome of this single, forgotten piece of land. The destiny of the Japanese Empire and the strategic future of the United States would be defined not in a single spectacular naval clash, but in a brutal, wet, and grinding war of attrition over a grass airfield. This was not a battle for a grand capital city or a symbolic fortress. It was a battle for a runway, a simple strip of crushed coral and mast and matting, and its outcome would determine the very trajectory of the entire war against Japan. The Battle of Guadalcanal represented the critical transition of the United States from a nation reeling on the defensive to a global power capable of projecting sustained offensive force across vast oceanic distances. It was a profound clash of military doctrines, a relentless battle of logistics and sheer will, where American industrial capacity and the raw tenacity of its individual soldiers, sailors, and airmen would meet for the first time in a sustained campaign. The deeply ingrained fanaticism, tactical discipline, and jungle combat experience of the Imperial Japanese Army. The island itself, a beautiful yet hostile and treacherous environment, became a third combatant, imposing its own brutal toll of disease, privation, and mental exhaustion equally upon both sides. Victory here would not be measured merely in territory conquered, but in the irrevocable rupture of an aura of invincibility that had surrounded Japanese forces since their stunning initial successes at Pearl Harbor, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. This was where the United States would learn, in the most difficult way possible, how to fight and win a modern war in the Pacific. The island of Guadalcanal, located in the southern Solomon Islands archipelago, was, until mid-1942, virtually unknown to the outside world. It was a large mountainous island, approximately 90 miles long and 30 miles wide, dominated by a steep, jungle-clad volcanic ridge that ran its length. The coastal plains were dense with coconut plantations, while the interior was a nearly impenetrable tangle of rainforest, sharp kunai grass, and swamps. Its climate was a miserable combination of oppressive, enervating heat and drenching, torrential humidity, a perfect breeding ground for malaria, dysentery, and a host of other debilitating tropical diseases. Its name would be etched into history books because of a single unfinished installation, an airstrip. In early July 1942, a Japanese construction unit, the 11th and 13th Construction Units, along with a small garrison of naval troops, landed on Guadalcanal's northern coast near the Lunga River and began clearing land for a large airfield. The strategic implication of this project was immediate and profound for Allied planners in Washington and Pearl Harbor. From a completed airfield at Guadalcanal, Japanese long-range bombers like the Mitsubishi G4M Betty could dominate the skies over the Coral Sea, interdict the vital sea lanes connecting the United States with Australia and New Zealand, and threaten any future Allied counteroffensive before it even began. The completion of this airstrip would represent a direct and potentially fatal stranglehold on Australia's lifeline, effectively isolating the continent and making it vulnerable to invasion or forced capitulation. Admiral Ernest J. King, the formidable and often irascible commander-in-chief of the US fleet, was adamant. He had long argued for a more aggressive stance in the Pacific, even as the Germany First policy remained the official Allied grand strategy. The news of the rapid Japanese airfield construction on Guadalcanal confirmed his worst fears about enemy expansion. He pushed for an immediate operation to seize the island before the airstrip became operational and could project its power. The operation, initially codenamed Operation Pestilence and later changed to the more evocative Operation Watchtower, was rushed into existence with an almost reckless haste. The target date was set for early August, giving military planners and the assigned forces an impossibly short timeline of only a few weeks to prepare. The unit designated for the assault was the 1st Marine Division, commanded by the experienced and steady Major General Alexander Archer Vandergrift. The division, however, was far from ready for a major combat operation. It was under strength, its component units were still arriving from the United States, and many of its men were green recruits who had never even seen a landing craft. They had been conducting basic training in New Zealand, but a full-scale, coordinated amphibious rehearsal was a luxury that time would not permit. The naval force assembled to carry the Marines to Guadalcanal was a multinational collection under the overall command of Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, whose flagship was the carrier USS Saratoga. The core of its air power was Task Force 61, centered on the three aircraft carriers, USS Saratoga, USS Enterprise, and USS Wasp. Their escorts included the new fast battleship USS North Carolina, a screen of heavy and light cruisers from both the US and Royal Australian Navy, and numerous destroyers. The amphibious transport force, commanded by the capable and hard-driving Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, consisted of a mix of transports and cargo ships carrying the Marines, their equipment, and their limited supplies. The logistical preparations for the landings were chaotic and fraught with error. The Marines were horrified to discover, upon arriving in Wellington, New Zealand, that the Navy's loading plan for their transport ships would make it impossible to unload critical supplies like ammunition, fuel, and rations quickly under combat conditions. The entire operation was viewed with deep skepticism by many senior officers involved, who feared it was being launched with insufficient forces, inadequate planning, and a dangerous lack of intelligence. Some, aware of the shoestring nature of the enterprise, wryly referred to it as Operation Shoestring. On the morning of August 7, 1942, the vast Allied armada arrived off the shores of Guadalcanal and the smaller, strategically important islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo to the north. The body of water separating them would soon earn the grim and enduring nickname Iron Bottom Sound. Surprise was total. As the sun rose, the naval bombardment began, with cruisers and destroyers shelling the suspected Japanese positions along the landing beaches. At 09:10 on Guadalcanal, the first waves of Marines from the 5th Regiment began landing on the beaches designated Red Beach. They waded ashore from their Higgins boats, expecting to be met by a storm of machine gun and mortar fire, but found none. The Japanese construction crews and their naval guards, completely taken by surprise, had abandoned the coastal area and fled inland into the thick jungle. The Marines quickly established a beachhead and began moving cautiously toward their primary objective, the nearly completed airfield. The initial landing was almost anticlimactic in its ease, a stark contrast to the fears of a bloody opposed landing. The story was dramatically and violently different just 20 miles away across the Sound, on the islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. Here, the Japanese garrisons, composed of elite special naval landing forces, were dug in and prepared to fight to the death. The landings on Tulagi began against fierce and immediate opposition. The Japanese defenders had dug themselves into caves, ravines, and heavily fortified positions, and they contested every inch of ground with machine guns, snipers, and determined counterattacks. The fighting was close quarters and brutal, relying on flamethrowers, grenades, and satchel charges to clear entrenched positions. It took 2 days of hard, bloody fighting by the Marine raiders and paratroopers to secure Tulagi. On the small, connected islands of Gavutu and Tanambogo, which were essentially coral outcroppings honeycombed with tunnels, the fight was even more intense. The Marines faced a nightmare of point-blank fire from hidden bunkers. It was a stark and sobering preview of the fanatical resistance the Allies would face for the remainder of the war in the Pacific. The cost of securing these small outposts was high, and the virtual annihilation of the Japanese defenders was a clear signal that the Japanese soldier would not yield easily and would often choose death over surrender. Back on Guadalcanal, the Marines continued their cautious advance toward the airfield, encountering only scattered sniper fire and abandoned positions. On August 8th, they reached the outskirts of the airfield. It was deserted. The Japanese had fled in such haste that they left behind a wealth of intact supplies, working trucks, diesel generators, large quantities of earth-moving equipment, a complete power plant, a valuable refrigeration unit, and vast stores of rice, canned fish, and sake. Most importantly, the airfield itself was nearly complete, requiring only additional grading and lengthening to be operational. The Marines immediately set to work finishing the job, renaming it Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton R. Henderson, a Marine aviator who had been killed leading his dive bomber squadron at the Battle of Midway. The capture of the airfield and its supplies was a tremendous, unexpected prize, but the battle for its permanent possession had only just begun. The relative ease of the landing was about to be shattered. The Japanese naval response was swift, decisive, and devastating. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the 8th Fleet, based at the major Japanese stronghold of Rabaul, reacted with impressive speed. He quickly assembled a formidable striking force of 5 heavy cruisers, Chokai, Aoba, Kako, Kinugasa, Furutaka, 2 light cruisers, Tenryu, Yubari, and a single destroyer. He raced down the Slot, the long channel running through the center of the Solomon Islands, to attack the vulnerable Allied invasion fleet. In the early hours of August 9th, Mikawa's force achieved complete tactical surprise, slipping past the inattentive Allied picket destroyers. In a brilliantly executed night attack, leveraging their extensive training in night combat and using float planes to drop illuminating flares, they unleashed a torrent of deadly accurate Type 93 long lance torpedoes and 8-inch shell fire on the Allied cruiser force guarding the transport anchorage off Savo Island. The ensuing Battle of Savo Island was one of the most crushing and humiliating defeats ever suffered by the US Navy. In less than 30 minutes of intense, one-sided combat, the Allied fleet was shattered. The heavy cruisers, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, and USS Astoria, and the Australian heavy cruiser Schmass Canberra were sunk. The heavy cruiser USS Chicago was severely damaged by a torpedo. Over 1,000 Allied sailors were killed in the blindingly fast engagement. Stunned by this catastrophic loss and fearing further destructive air attacks from Japanese land-based bombers at Rabaul after dawn, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who had already lost a significant number of his carrier-based fighters in the preceding days, made the controversial and heavily criticized decision to withdraw the vital carrier task forces. Without air cover, Admiral Turner had no choice but to pull out the entire amphibious force as well. On the afternoon of August 9th, the transport ships, still laden with over half the Marines' essential supplies, much of their heavy artillery, ammunition, and a large portion of their food, departed for the safer harbour of Noumea. The Marines on shore watched in stunned disbelief and growing dread as their lifelines sailed over the horizon. They were now completely alone on a hostile island, potentially outnumbered by a determined enemy of unknown strength, with only the supplies they had managed to unload in the first 2 days. Enough ammunition for about 10 days of intense fighting, and food for just over a month. They held a valuable airfield, but they were isolated, besieged, and terrifyingly vulnerable. The true, brutal test of Operation Watchtower was now beginning in earnest. The campaign had transitioned from an amphibious assault to a desperate siege. The initial Japanese high command reaction to the American landings was one of disbelief and profound underestimation. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, viewing the situation through a lens of racial and military superiority, initially viewed the American operation as a mere reconnaissance in force, not a serious, determined attempt to hold the island. The task of retaking Guadalcanal was assigned to the 17th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, who was based at Rabaul and was concurrently planning a major offensive on the Kokoda Track in New Guinea. Hyakutake, similarly dismissive of American fighting prowess, initially believed a single, sharp blow delivered by a modest force would be sufficient to dislodge the Marines. The unit chosen for this task was the Ichiki Detachment, led by the aggressive and overconfident Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki. This force, numbering about 917 men, was an elite unit that had been originally intended for the invasion of Midway. Confident in the superiority of the Japanese soldiers' fighting spirit, Ichiki and an advance party of his men were transported to Guadalcanal by 6 fast destroyers on August 18th, landing at Taiyu Point, well east of the marine perimeter at Lunga. Ichiki, eager for personal glory and certain of a quick victory, decided not to wait for his entire force to be landed. He immediately advanced westward with roughly 800 of his men, planning a swift, decisive night attack to throw the disorganized Americans into the sea. He believed the Marines would break and run under a determined, frenzied assault. On the night of August 21st, Ichiki launched a reckless frontal attack against the Marine positions defending the eastern flank of the perimeter, which ran along the bank of a small tidal creek the Marines called Alligator Creek. Due to a misreading of maps, it would be immortalized in history as the Battle of the Tenaru River. The Marines of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, were well dug in behind a natural sandbar, their interlocking fields of fire for machine guns and rifles carefully pre-planned and zeroed in. The Japanese attack was a tragic study in futile courage and flawed tactics. Just after midnight, Ichiki's troops launched a series of frantic, screaming banzai charges directly into the interlocking fields of fire of the Marine machine guns, which included deadly 30 caliber Brownings and 37mm anti-tank guns firing canister shot. The result was a horrific massacre. The Japanese soldiers were systematically cut down in waves as they tried to cross the open sandbar. Flares, fired from ships offshore and from within the perimeter, illuminated the nightmarish scene, revealing heaps of dead and dying. Some small, determined groups managed to infiltrate the Marine lines, leading to desperate, savage hand-to-hand fighting in the darkness. But the main Marine line held firm. At dawn, with the Japanese force decimated and disorganized, the Marines launched a powerful counterattack. Light M3 Stuart tanks were brought up, and they rumbled along the beach, methodically crushing Japanese soldiers who were trapped against the sea. The Ichiki detachment was effectively annihilated as a fighting force. Colonel Ichiki, realizing the totality of his failure and the disgrace it brought, reportedly burned his regiment's colors and was killed, most likely by his own hand. The Battle of the Tenaru was a profound shock to the Japanese command. It demonstrated unequivocally that the Americans were not only there to stay, but were also a formidable, well-armed, and tenacious fighting force. It also established a tragic and costly pattern for the Japanese that would repeat itself. Direct, costly frontal assaults against prepared defenses, relying on morale over materiel, would lead to catastrophic casualties. The struggle for Guadalcanal was a tripartite battle, fought simultaneously on land, at sea, and in the air, with each domain critically influencing the others. Control of the seas around the island was paramount, for it dictated which side could reinforce and supply its troops. The Japanese, realizing they could not operate slow, vulnerable transport ships within range of American aircraft during daylight hours, developed the system that would become known as the Tokyo Express. This was not a single unit, but a tactical process. Fast warships, primarily destroyers and sometimes light cruisers, would race down the slot under cover of darkness, discharge troops and minimal supplies at landing points like Tassafaronga or Kamimbo Bay, bombard Henderson Field if possible, and then retreat at high speed before dawn. While this method was effective at delivering men, it was woefully inadequate for delivering the heavy equipment, artillery, vehicles, and large quantities of food, ammunition, and medical supplies needed to sustain a large army. The troops often arrived with little more than their rifles, a small amount of ammunition, and a bag of rice, already weakened by their journey. The American counterpart to the Tokyo Express was the Cactus Air Force. BITS Cactus was the Allied codename for Guadalcanal, and the Air Force was a motley, cobbled together, yet incredibly resilient collection of Navy, Marine, and later Army Air Force planes that operated from the dirt and steel-matted runways of Henderson Field. The 1st Squadron of Marine Wildcat fighters, VMF 223, landed on August 20th, followed soon after by SBD Dauntless dive bombers of VMSB 232. Life for these aviators and their ground crews was incredibly harsh and dangerous. They lived on short rations, endured almost nightly shelling from Japanese warships or Washing Machine Charlie nuisance bombers, and fought off daily air raids from Rabaul. The airfield itself was a constant target, and the ground crews performed miracles of maintenance to keep planes flying in the primitive, muddy conditions. The Cactus Air Force became the absolute linchpin of the American defense. Its ability to control the skies for 100 miles around Guadalcanal during the day made the waters around the island a killing zone for Japanese shipping. Every Japanese attempt to land significant forces or supplies had to run a deadly gauntlet of American air power, which grew steadily in strength and experience. The next major Japanese effort to dislodge the Marines came in September. General Hyakutake, now taking the threat much more seriously, dispatched the 35th Infantry Brigade under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, a force of about 6,000 men. Kawaguchi devised a more sophisticated plan than Ichiki's simple frontal assault. He intended to march his main force through the treacherous jungle south of the Marine perimeter and attack Henderson Field from the south and southeast, where the American defenses were believed to be weak or non-existent. The march was a logistical and physical nightmare. The Japanese soldiers, burdened with their gear, struggled through some of the most difficult terrain on Earth: steep, razor-backed ridges, deep, muddy ravines, swarming mosquitoes, and relentless heat. The narrow jungle trail became a river of mud. Kawaguchi was forced to abandon most of his heavy weapons, including his artillery and heavy mortars, along the trail. His troops arrived at their assembly areas exhausted, hungry, disorganized, and behind schedule. General Vandergrift, a cautious and thorough commander, had anticipated a potential threat from the south. He had ordered the perimeter defenses to be extended and strengthened in that direction. A key position was a long, grassy, relatively bare ridge that ran diagonally across the Lunga Plain south of the airfield. This was held by a composite battalion of the elite 1st Marine Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachute Battalion under the command of the charismatic, aggressive, and highly respected Colonel Merritt A. Red Mike Edson. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi's weary and disorganized troops began their assault on what would become known forever as Edson's Ridge, or Bloody Ridge. The fighting over the next 2 nights was some of the most intense, savage, and desperate of the entire Pacific War. The Japanese attacked in repeated, frenzied waves, trying to overwhelm the outnumbered Marine positions through sheer weight of numbers and ferocity. The Marines, dug in on the high ground, held their fire until the last moment, then unleashed a storm of machine gun, rifle, mortar, and 37mm anti-tank gunfire. The battles often disintegrated into chaotic, shadowy melees of bayonets, knives, and entrenching tools in the inky blackness. Naval star shells, fired by American destroyers offshore, periodically lit up the battlefield, turning night into an eerie, flickering day and revealing the advancing Japanese ranks for the Marines to engage. After 2 nights of relentless, bloody attacks, Kawaguchi's brigade was broken and defeated. They withdrew into the jungle, leaving behind hundreds of dead. The defense of Edson's Ridge was a monumental victory for the Marines. It solidified their hold on Henderson Field, proved they could defeat a much larger Japanese force in a pitched battle for a key objective, and provided an immense boost to American morale. It was a clear sign that the Marines could not only hold, but could also win. The battle of attrition continued relentlessly through October. Both sides poured reinforcements into the island in a desperate race that mirrored the larger industrial contest between Japan and the United States. The Americans managed to land the 7th Marine Regiment, bringing Vandergrift's total strength to nearly 23 WWII men, though many were suffering from malaria and fatigue. The Japanese, now fully committed to retaking Guadalcanal at any cost, began shipping the bulk of the veteran 2nd Sendai Division, one of their best units in the entire army, to the island. General Hyakutake himself arrived on the island to take personal command of the escalating operation. The Japanese plan for October was a massive, coordinated offensive from the south and west, designed to overwhelm the Marine perimeter once and for all. To support this decisive ground offensive, they planned a devastating, multi-layered bombardment of Henderson Field to completely neutralize the Cactus Air Force, which they correctly identified as the key to American resistance. On the night of October 13th, the The Japanese executed this plan with terrifying efficiency and power. Two Congo-class fast battleships, the Congo and Haruna, boldly sailed into Iron Bottom Sound and for over an hour systematically and methodically shelled Henderson Field with their 14-inch guns. They fired nearly 1,000 high-explosive shells directly into the American positions. The bombardment was apocalyptic in its effect. The airfield was cratered beyond immediate use. Almost every aircraft on the ground was destroyed or damaged, and the precious aviation fuel stores were set ablaze in a towering inferno that lit up the night sky. It was the single most destructive blow the Americans had suffered on the island. Morale among the defenders plummeted. For a brief, critical period, it seemed the Japanese had finally succeeded in knocking out the American air arm and opening the way for their transports and warships to operate with impunity. Yet, American resilience, ingenuity, and sheer hard labor prevailed in the face of disaster. The Navy's Seabees and Marine engineers, working with a desperate urgency through the night and the following day, used every available piece of equipment to fill craters and repair the main runway. Aided by the arrival of replacement aircraft courageously flown in from Espirito Santo and a daring daylight run by a Navy PBY Catalina flying boat that delivered emergency drums of avgas, the Cactus Air Force was, miraculously, back in a limited operational state within 48 hours. The Japanese ground offensive, however, was already in motion. Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama led the main attack force on another grueling, disorienting jungle march to the south of the ridge. The march took longer and was more exhausting than planned, completely disrupting the carefully synchronized attack timetable. When his exhausted, disorganized, and hungry troops finally emerged from the jungle on the nights of October 24th and 25, they launched a series of uncoordinated and piecemeal attacks against the now alert and heavily reinforced American lines. The results were a bloody repeat of the Battle of Edson's Ridge, but on a larger and even more costly scale. The Japanese Sendai Division was cut to pieces in futile, courageous charges against well-sighted Marine positions, particularly at a fortified complex the Americans called the Gifu. The attacks were a catastrophic failure. The Japanese suffered thousands of casualties for no tactical gain whatsoever. Simultaneously with these land battles, the opposing navies clashed in the large and complex Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. It was another major carrier duel. The Americans lost the carrier USS Hornet and had the Enterprise damaged, forcing it to retire for repairs. The Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuiho were also significantly damaged. While a tactical victory for the Japanese in terms of ships sunk, the battle proved to be another strategic loss in the long term. The Japanese again lost a large number of their irreplaceable veteran naval aviators, whose skills could not be quickly replaced. These cumulative losses in experienced aircrew would haunt the Japanese carrier fleet for the remainder of the war, critically weakening it for future engagements. The failure of the major October offensive marked the effective end of Japan's strategic ability to mount a large-scale offensive to retake Guadalcanal. The initiative began to slowly, inexorably shift to the Americans. In November, a significant and sustained American reinforcement began. The 2nd Marine Division, the Army's Americal Division, and other units began to arrive in substantial numbers, gradually replacing the battered, malaria-ridden, and exhausted 1st Marine Division. Overall command of the ground forces was eventually handed over to the U.S. Army's Major General Alexander Patch. The Americans were now building up for their own offensive to clear the entire island. The Japanese High Command, however, was not yet ready to concede defeat. They planned one final massive effort to reinforce the island in mid-November, transporting the bulk of the 38th Infantry Division in a convoy of 11 slow transports, heavily protected by a powerful battleship and cruiser force. This major commitment triggered the decisive and incredibly chaotic naval Battle of Guadalcanal, a brutal 3-night melee of surface engagements from November 13th to 15. The first night saw a wild, close-range and confused brawl between an outgunned American force of cruisers and destroyers and a Japanese bombardment force that included the battleship Hiei. In the fierce point-blank action, American admirals Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott were both killed, but their ships managed to cripple the Hiei. which was sunk by relentless American air attacks from Henderson Field and the Enterprise. The next day, marking the first loss of a Japanese battleship in the war. The second night featured a dramatic, modern battleship duel. The American battleships USS Washington and USS South Dakota engaged the Japanese battleship Kirishima. The South Dakota suffered a crippling electrical failure that blacked out the ship and was pummeled by Japanese shell fire, but the Washington, undetected, used its advanced radar fire control to blast the Kirishima at point-blank range, inflicting fatal damage and sinking it. Meanwhile, by day, relentless attacks from the Cactus Air Force and aircraft from the Enterprise sank 7 of the 11 Japanese transports. The few thousand Japanese soldiers who managed to make it ashore did so without most of their heavy equipment, artillery, and supplies. The naval Battle of Guadalcanal was an unambiguous American strategic victory. It broke the back of the Japanese Navy's willingness to challenge the Americans in the waters around Guadalcanal in daylight and ended any realistic hope of sustaining their large army on the island. The tide had turned irrevocably. For the Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal, the situation after mid-November deteriorated rapidly into a hellish nightmare of starvation, disease, and despair. Isolated and cut off from adequate supplies due to the American naval and air superiority, they began to starve. Disease ran rampant through their malnourished ranks. Dysentery, malaria, and beriberi weakened and killed more men than American bullets. They were reduced to eating roots, tree bark, insects, and any small animal they could catch. Their physical condition became appalling. They were walking skeletons in ragged uniforms. General Patch, now in command of the newly formed 14th Corps, began a methodical, powerful offensive to clear the island. On January 10, 1943, American forces launched a major push to the west, driving the remnants of the Japanese army along the northern coast. The advance was slow and grueling, hampered more by the difficult terrain than by organized resistance, though there were still fierce, costly fights at fortified positions like the Gifu, the Galloping Horse, and Mount Austin. The Japanese, though starving and sick, often fought with their characteristic tenacity from well-concealed bunkers and caves. By the end of January, the Japanese high command in Tokyo finally faced the grim reality. They could not save their army on Guadalcanal. Continuing to pour resources into the island was futile. In a remarkably daring and well-executed operation, codenamed K, the Japanese Navy conducted a surprise evacuation using its destroyers. Over 3 nights in early February, 4 and 7th February 1943, they successfully evacuated nearly 11 worn, emaciated, and sick survivors from Cape Esperance, the westernmost point of the island. It was a brilliant tactical withdrawal carried out under the very noses of the Americans, who were completely fooled into believing the destroyer movements were yet another reinforcement run of the Tokyo Express. On February 9, 1943, American patrols from the 161st Infantry Regiment linked up at Cape Esperance, meeting no organized resistance. General Patch radioed his superior the famous message, "Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal." The 6-month-long battle, one of the longest and most sustained campaigns of the Pacific War, was finally over. The cost in human life and material had been staggering. The United States and its allies lost approximately 700 men killed, 600 ground troops, 900 sailors and 600 airmen, and over 800 wounded. The Japanese losses were catastrophic and on a different scale entirely. An estimated 19 Azawanos killed in ground combat, 500 in air battles, and as many as 9 Azawanano dead from disease and starvation. Only about 1 Afarozano were taken prisoner, a testament to the Japanese ethos of no surrender. The material losses in ships and aircraft were heavy for both sides, but the loss of Japan's core of veteran naval aircrews was a blow from which its once mighty carrier fleet would never fully recover. The Battle of Guadalcanal was the definitive turning point in the Pacific War. It was the first time Japanese ground forces had been decisively defeated in a sustained campaign and forced to evacuate a captured objective. The strategic initiative, seized by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor and held for 6 months, was now irrevocably in Allied hands and would never be relinquished. The campaign tested and ultimately proved American amphibious doctrine, equipment, and the raw determination of its forces in all domains: terrestrial, aerial, and maritime. The most crucial lesson, learned at great cost, was the overwhelming importance of logistics, air superiority, and the integration of naval, air, and land power. The fight for a single primitive airfield on a remote island in the South Pacific fundamentally shaped the entire course of the war against Japan and marked the true beginning of the long, bloody, and island-strewn American march toward the Japanese home islands. The victory at Guadalcanal not only secured the vital line of communication with Australia, but also provided an essential, if painful, model for all subsequent Allied amphibious campaigns in the Pacific. It was here, in the mud, heat, and horror of Guadalcanal, that the United States learned the hardest lessons of amphibious warfare and jungle combat, lessons that would be applied with increasing skill and overwhelming force in the battles to come, at Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Guadalcanal was the crucible, the fiery trial in which the American military machine in the Pacific was forged, tempered, and ultimately proven victorious.